interested in how you see peace and justice connected.
Well, one of my favorite songs comes from a very different tradition. It comes from the Jamaican tradition. And it's a song that says, without justice, there'll be no peace. And it really speaks to me now, and it's funny that I sort of came to my own experience of my Jamaican culture and so forth a little bit later in life, I guess, or as a young adult. But when I heard that song, it really spoke to me. And the idea that the two are really linked, but for me, the fact that it puts justice first is really important when we think about peace and justice. So often we say, peace and justice, so we can kind of put them together. And so often we put peace first in the Brethren traditions and in the culture, it's on earth peace, it's not on earth justice. And what are the conditions for peace? What makes peace happen? We often look at peace and we sort of look for the symptoms of peace. We look for the absence of war, we look for the absence of violence, the absence of conflict. But we're not looking at what is the foundation on which that peace is going to rest most successfully. And for me, the idea that justice is so key to that foundation really speaks to me, because it says, wow, we have looked around at what's causing the violence, what's causing the conflict, what's causing tension, what's causing inequality, and we've created a system that's got justice. And somehow if we do that, that peace can flow from that really is important. And that without it, we're going to keep returning to conflicts we've seen before. Without really creating justice, I think that even if we create peace, it won't be a lasting peace in the way we would like to see.
Thanks. So,
but I have to ask you, where is the heart for justice in your work right now and in the organization? How is this awareness to justice coming forward?
It kind of is always percolating and pushing up through the ground, if you will, because we don't have an articulated statement or vision of that. And the phrase that you talked about is, without justice there is no peace, and sometimes in a chant environment it's no justice, no peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like to take that chant and spell the no, K-N-O-W, no justice, no peace, because I personally kind of live in a world where I see people talking about justice, and I don't think we have anywhere near a common understanding of what that means.
Right.
So I know, I have a lot of progressive friends, have a very clear sense of what justice means to them, and in any given situation they can tell you what's just and unjust, and they will. and I have conservative friends or acquaintances, and on these same situations their views will often be diametrically opposed to each other. So I think that somebody, I'm not saying On Earth Peace should be doing this, but I don't know who should be doing it or who could be doing it. Somebody needs to just create a safe space for people to explore justice with each other, what it means to them, explore differences. It wouldn't be this kind of format. It would be a really around the table kind of conversational format. But I think until we get there, we're in a society and culture where people are just talking across each other, talking over each other. I just don't think we have a strong discovery of what that means.
And I like the idea of the no coming from the term of knowledge, because so often there's an emotional response that's not grounded in an intellectual response, it's not grounded in a studied response, it's not grounded in something that's really taken the time to develop and to know. The difference between I think I know and I know, or the difference between I feel and I know, is so important. And when considering justice, sometimes we don't even know what the issues are surrounding the whole context. We think we know what justice is in a situation, but we only know a part of the story or a part of the picture, and we're looking at one slice of it from one angle and saying, this is justice for this situation. But really there's so much more on the plate, there's so much more in the story, and that knowing is really sort of unpacking more and more and just fully embracing the complications that our lives are.
the levels, the perspectives, the different experiences, right? So that's cool. Yeah. I guess another question I would ask you is, uhuru.
Uhura.
Uhura, thank you.
Yes.
Sounds like a sounds like a uhura. Sounds like a celebration. Look a couple decades down the road and your vision of peace for her and her world.
Uhura's my daughter, and I think that's important to clarify. And right now she's 5 months old.
Right.
And this is a conversation that we have in my family. Mm-hmm. We are a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious family. And so some of my picture of peace and some of what I've always envisioned came very much from my Brethren heritage. And it came very much grounded in this Germanic Anabaptist pietist tradition. And that's been great for me. But that's not something that she's automatically going to have access to. It's not something that immediately happens. And there's this whole other tradition in her life of peace and how that shapes up, and all these other cultures that inform the discussion of what is peace, what is justice, what should the world look like, what could it look like. And so I'm just really struck by how complicated this conversation is for me. Right. Because I want to know everything, and I want to understand, and I want to be able to teach her everything that I know, and I want her to be ready to learn everything that her father has to teach her, and that her grandparents have to teach her, and her uncles have to teach her. And at the same time, I realize she's going to make her own decision about how she wants to hear this, and which parts of this identities that are around her is she going to hold more closely. And I'm sure, like myself, I'm sure it'll change across the course of her life. We all go through phases with different elements. So I don't think that I have an answer this is what it looks like for her. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's that I want to prepare her to hold peace as a value that's important, to see it as something that's valuable in her life as an individual, valuable in her community wherever she decides to put down roots, and valuable in the wider world community. And I'd like to see her understand that she can be a peacemaker. It's very important to me that she understands that it's not something that's external. The world has peace or it doesn't, or I live in a community with peace or I don't. But that she has a responsibility to make peace wherever conflict or violence is found in her life story. And that's not always sort of the grand missional, we've gone to a war zone and we've created peace treaties. But there's smaller ways to do it, there are larger ways to do it. I think for the next generation, the question of environmental justice and how that violence that we've committed on our planet is only becoming more and more apparent and more important. So I think that'll probably be part of what I want to teach her and what I want her to be aware of. But for me, it's just about giving her the tools and the perspective that she can continue this conversation. So it's not just you and me having this, but this conversation will be something that she would be prepared to walk in and talk about and think about with others for her own life.
Thanks.
Yeah. When you look back to your parents, to your grandparents, what messages did they give you about peace that prepared you to enter this moment, this position, this conversation?
That's a really interesting question. My father left high school to enlist in World War II.
Okay.
And then went back to high school when he came back. And some people enlisted and they didn't get actively engaged or deployed. He did.
Where?
He was in the Asian theater, and he was a rear gunner on one of those bombardier planes that have like a 5-person crew, I think. So they have a pilot and a bombardier and a rear gunner, and I don't know, but you see him in movies. You see those so the guy who sat down in the bubble at the back of the plane with the machine, that was his thing. Yep. And they flew dozens and dozens of missions, for lack of that's what they would call them.
That's what they called them, yeah.
They flew dozens and dozens. They even got very high-ranking medals for having had part of their engine blown out and choosing to go forward and continue rather than go back. So he brought back a unique experience that he never talked about. And I remember with my younger cousins, sometimes we would find these medals and things like that in a chest in my grandmother's attic. And then gradually we would eke pieces of the story out from my mother, and eventually when I was older he would talk to me a little bit about it. So I knew that that had affected him, and I knew that it had tempered him in some way, but it didn't fundamentally change. I mean, this was a generation that believed that that was the good war, and didn't fundamentally change that, but it certainly made him a lot more sober about these things, and he was one of those who didn't talk about it. But here's the interesting thing. I believe that he had PTSD.
Wow.
And I believe, in retrospect, that my entire generation was raised by a generation, most of which had PTSD, because that war mobilization was massive.
Yeah.
Both the effect at the home front, and hundreds of thousands or millions of primarily men that were sent over. And when I look back at the things we experienced as kids and teenagers in those years, and the things that I saw in the inexplicable behaviors I saw in my friends, and some of the random violence and things like that. In retrospect, it's very clear to me that we were a PTSD nation, and that we were actually raised by a generation that had PTSD, and neither they nor we knew there was such a thing, knew what it meant, knew what was going on with them or us. So I think that that's affected me and my peers a lot.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really thought-provoking for me to think about.
You mentioned environmental justice.
I did.
Tell me more about your views on environmental justice.
Oh my goodness, that's like opening a can of worms. Like,
hey.
Tell me your views about, anything.
I like to ask clear yes or no answers. Yes or no questions, I mean. Yeah.
Environmental justice can take many forms. And I would not even begin to claim to be an expert on environmental justice. It's really something that's complicated by the levels at which you can approach it. So on one level, I sort of see that we have this huge planet, and our planet is not doing well. We have species extinctions, and we have areas of the planet where you can look and say, oh my gosh, these are places where the biodiversity is failing, where you've got whole ecosystems that are collapsing. And you can look at environmental justice through the lens if you have the way that race and class are impacted where people live. And so you have people that are living in places that are not safe, living in places where the groundwater is poisoned, living in places where nuclear fallout exists, and always these communities are poor. And frequently they're of color, and all of a sudden you start looking at, there's incredible amounts of cancer in these communities. And I think that's a type of environmental justice. And there's so many ways to address it, and I think that each and every one of them is very important. And I wish that I had a million lives and a million selves so I could go forth and learn about each of these. Because this is a place where I would say my knowledge, like I said, I'm not an expert, my know, as you would say, my knowledge about environmental justice needs to grow so much more. But I look at where do I have impact, and what choices do I have, and what choices do I make. And I look at my life. I lead a very middle class urban life in Washington, D.C., and I came across a quote that said, the greatest vehicle we have to change the world is a shopping cart. What do we put in our shopping carts? Where does it come from? How do we spend our money? If, they talk about your vote, your dollar, where am I voting with my dollar? And so that has changed that perspective, and wanting to do better by the environment, wanting to do better by the planet, wanting to do better by biodiversity and looking at where is it I'm doing things, where am I spending things, where could I change my behaviors, has led me to become very involved with local agriculture, sustainable agriculture, choosing to eat more plant products and less animal products, and not that I'm a vegetarian by any means, but looking at those questions, wanting to have my food sources come as much as possible from local places, from places where I feel that the land is treated well, the animals and the plants are well treated. I'm very careful about genetically modified organisms entering my diet stream because I don't like what that means. Not so much for myself. I mean, they don't know whether it makes me sick or not, but what does it mean for the larger system? And I think that impacts also how capitalism works, and sort of who can we own the patents of genomes of plants? And increasingly, it seems that capitalists think we can. So I really try to go for that. Having a kid, everybody jokes about the amount of stuff that babies bring into your life. And I was very alarmed by the amount of stuff that was suggested. And I intentionally chose to look at things that could be regifted, asking friends who already had kids, you know, what are you done with? What are you ready to pass on? What are you ready to give? Choosing cloth diapers. My husband teases me because paper towels are emergencies only. I believe in the kitchen tea towel, and we have lots of them. And he said, you can't do this and have kids. And I said, we can. Our parents did this very easily. Our grandparents definitely did this. But so for me, the question of environmental justice is something that I've narrowed down to what can I do differently.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
That's interesting.
You come out of a very different tradition than most of the people involved with On Earth Peace, and very different tradition from the roots of On Earth Peace. So I imagine that you come with a vision for where the branches of On Earth Peace are going to go, and the branches for how that work can develop. And I would just love to hear you say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually come out of a confluence of traditions, so I didn't.
As we all do.
Yeah, no, but I didn't grow up with a single heritage. I kind of morphed through different ones, and then being a student of religion, kind of grafted on many other influences too. But that's an interesting question, and it's a question I faced when I interviewed for the position here too, because I'm sort of the first person to be brought in from outside the Church of the Brethren. And one of the things I explain very clearly is if you live in Western society, or for sure in U.S. society, and you are associated in some way with the Jesus movement and you're committed to peace, you've been influenced by the historic peace churches.
Yeah.
Because these things get into our culture and circulate in our culture as memes that are not necessarily sourced or identified. It's like looking for patient zero in an outbreak. Right. But completely and totally, the Brethren have influenced my life before I knew there were such things as Brethren. And little glimmers, you know, as a older teenager, when I would study things in history, you know, I'd learn about the historic peace churches in World War I and the FOR and things like that. So these influences work their way in as part of the total ingredients that end up baking the cake. So I look at the Brethren DNA in particular as being a very unique strain because it has the Anabaptist component and it has the Pietist component. And I think that unique strain has a lot to offer our culture in general and the Jesus movement in particular. And so I look to try and help bring just Brethren values, Brethren attitudes through the work of On Earth Peace, and help spread the memes, help infect the population, and infect the church with the DNA that represents. And what would you describe it as? It's the person and relationship first. It's the person of Jesus over the doctrines of the church or the disciplines of the church. Although our Anabaptist roots are a little different. So that's why that unique blending is there.
Right.
If we were just Anabaptist, we'd be, well, Mennonites, right? Or, you know, or something like that. But when you put those two together, it's a very unique, powerful blend that I think the world needs, and I see the world taking on. I see the work that our General Secretary, Stan Notzinger, does as he travels around the globe and meets with all the different heads of communions and denominations. You can see the Brethren influence. You see it in current events today with what's happening in the movement around Nigeria or the movement around Syria. You see the Brethren influence. We're not the sole stream flowing into that, but it's disproportionately influential, and that's a good thing. Yeah. So I see Honor of Peace as a gift from the Church of the Brethren to the broader Jesus movement and church, that we can maybe help other people rediscover and renew the gospel of peace. Because I see the gospel of Jesus as a gospel of peace. And I think maybe that's not as visible to the general Jesus movement at large.
Yeah. So I'm doing intercultural ministries with the Church of the Brethren right now. And one of the things that I'm turning over in my mind and thinking about is, what is the message for peace that Honor of Peace has to share with communities that want to be more intercultural with, and I look at that both as churches that maybe have been historically predominantly Anglo and are now looking at opening up, if not even just on Sunday morning, but opening up the way they work within their community organizing and outreach, as well as congregations that come from other traditions that are drawn to the Brethren, the Brethren part of the Jesus movement, even though ethnically they've come in from places that the Brethren haven't historically been, or maybe not, or we at least don't associate with being Brethren. And how is peace relevant to those groups?
Well, I was sort of tracking with the first part of the question, and then it kind of took a left turn, so I'm just going to go with both of them or whatever. I'll respond to the first part and just assume that it's relevant to those groups. So our team has got a lot of experience with just living with the core disciplines of conflict transformation and nonviolent social change, in the core disciplines that our ministries are about at Honor of Peace. And I think we've learned a lot through difficult experience, through many years, about the limitations of the way we've done things, and maybe what works and what doesn't work. And so from our point of view, we are almost anywhere we go in other realms, intercultural realms, we have to come as students and participants rather than as leaders, because we don't have a high degree of cultural competency, cultural literacy. I certainly don't, as the leader of the organization. Our team has quite a bit more than me, but it's not a core strength or life experience that we bring. But we certainly bring an awareness and humility to learn and to recognize that we don't, and maybe help other groups that we work with realize that that's important for them too, to understand that we don't all understand each other, and we don't even know how to understand each other, but we've got things about how to listen, how to not listen, how to interact, how to not interact. We also have a lot of things about how to address a lot of disciplines and things to offer about how to address making change, and how to do it in ways that build relationships rather than destroy relationships, and ways that lead to reconciliation in the beloved community rather than to one party temporarily winning over another party. So I think we've got a lot to offer, but we have so much to gain and learn from being involved in any such experiences.
I really appreciate that you use the term humility. That's one of the things that has been, if you want to say percolating up, to pick up on an earlier metaphor, in my work has been the percolating up of cultural humility, which is sort of a newish term in the conversation about intercultural, multicultural, cross-cultural. And now people are talking about cultural humility, which is, are you familiar with this term at all?
No, but I
well,
love to
I'll tell
learn.
you a little bit about it then. It's coming actually out of the medical profession originally, and traces back to sort of the late 90s, mid-90s, and is moving very steadily into psychology forms as things move from the medical into the next stage. Psychologists are feeling a lot of need for it. By cultural humility, they said a lot of what you said, which is, we don't know. We don't know everything. We may not be as familiar with the context, but we have a specific set of skills, medical skills, skills about, counseling psychology, that we would like to apply because we think it can help you. But we don't know your culture, and we know we don't know. And so it's a shift away from this expertise to this model of saying, we've got some skills to help you with, but we don't have everything. Right. And I really appreciate, how is that perspective, which I'm sort of sharing with you and kind of, I think we're mirroring in this conversation a little bit, how is that perspective changing how On Earth Peace works? And how it does what it does in its programs?
It's interesting because for the last 2 years, we've gotten weekly inquiries from Africa, Nigeria, the Great Lakes area, and we've kind of deflected them for the longest time because we know we don't know. I mean, we don't even know in the U.S. We don't even know all the depth and breadth of cultures there. You talk about a different continent, where different languages are predominant and the differences are even more stark. Now we're getting to the point where we're willing to expose ourselves to relationship with people, to the beginning of relationship. So I think one of the things we've done quite recently is we started to say, okay, what do you have in mind? What can we learn together? What can you teach us? What are you trying to find from us? And so it's a kind of a openness to a mutual mentorship that's been finding a way for us to expand our horizons gradually rather than just keep deflecting all of these calls that keep coming in, because at some point we start asking ourselves, who are we saying no to? I mean, who are we turning away? What are we turning away from? So I think that the humility is helping us find a little crack to open a door to greater possibility. It's not like we're going to rush off and, we couldn't even rush off into the inner city, not to mention rushing off to the Great Lakes or a portion of the Great Lakes region in Africa, because it's not a monolith. They're all unique, different situations. So I think in some sense, it's really helping us become ever so slightly more accessible and a little bit more adventurous, if you will. Yeah. Realizing that, well, we know we don't know, and that's okay. It's a good thing. It's really, I loved your analogy with the medical profession, because that's how we feel. I mean, we have pretty much clinical level skills when it comes to helping people do nonviolent social change, or helping groups do interpersonal conflict or intra-group conflict, things like that. So how do you then come into an environment that you don't know, where people recognize that they have some need or interest for what you have, but how do you translate and connect that? How do you learn that? So that was really cool.
I don't know about for you, but for me, sometimes work can feel like an endless round of email chasing and conference calls and fundraising, and there's sort of the mechanics of doing a job. But every now and again, I have a moment or an experience where there's sort of a pullback. I'm like, this is why I do that. I don't write email to get an email back. In fact, sometimes I wish you wouldn't reply. But no, in all seriousness, that there are these moments when the work kind of pulls back from the day-to-day details. And you have this, this is why I do this. Can you share one of those that you've had since being at On Earth Peace?
Oh gosh, for me, that's a daily experience, or almost hourly experience. Part of that is just, natural chemistry, I mean, I just respond to those kinds of things. So what would I pick? Even just being here, the things that I've learned at this gathering in the half day I've been here, because let's face it, most of the people that come here might be theologically quite different than me, culturally quite different than me. We're at a church planting conference for our viewers at home. Yeah. And yet these people, they bring such experience, they bring such commitment, they bring such insight, and the insight that they bring is applicable to the things that I'm doing or trying to decide. So we've been trying to focus, we've been working on what we call thought experiments. Okay. How to sharpen our focus. You know how in science, physicists, theoretical physicists use thought experiments, and then eventually they go out and do real experiments around those. And just looking at how the church planters think about engaging different age groups or different aesthetic orientations or different cultural orientations, it just floods over me about, wow, maybe I better rethink some of the thought experiments I've been doing, because my horizons are being expanded. And that kind of thing for me is like an hourly experience, maybe because I have so much to learn.
Maybe it's also your personality. I think there are some people and some times in our lives when we're just so open to it that everything just seems to be coming together in that way in the universe, and that's wonderful. It's really wonderful.
That's a cool question. That was an interesting question. Tell me one of yours most recently.
I think for me it comes in relationship. That's where I see it. And you said earlier about putting the people first, and for me, the moments in my work that I love are when the people are first, and particularly when people begin to tell a piece of the story, of their story, that you haven't heard before. So I want to say it was the end of last month, I was in Santa Ana in California. It's a church in one of the suburbs of LA, and it's the Prince de Paz Church. It's not, denominationally, it's not been as active. They haven't sent representatives to annual conference in a long time. It's a church that was historically white, but it's now in a Hispanic community. And it's a Hispanic community that really struggles with violence, struggles with issues of class, a lot of immigration. The majority of the congregation, I would say, is undocumented, and a lot of people that are really just, struggling to realize a portion of the American dream, why they came here and what they hope for their children. And talking with the pastor there, Richard Zapata, about his vision, and hearing him talk about some of the things that he's seen, and particularly him sharing about a young man in the congregation who has come up through their youth group and is gone to college and has this vision for his career path and is really capturing an opportunity to build a different kind of future. And he's staying in the church, and he's taking young people to NYC. And then I meet this young man, and I have an opportunity to talk with him and to work with him and to talk, what is his vision for these kids he's bringing to NYC? What could I do to help make this a positive experience for them? And seeing that it's not just one relationship, but that web of relationships, the way that when you talk with one person, it ripples out. And that just leaves me so excited about my work.
That is a really exciting story. He's staying in the church and he's staying in his community.
Yes.
Which is a huge step.
He wants to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I keep telling people, this is the next generation of leadership. We don't know him yet. Like, if I were to tell you something, it'd just be like, yeah, okay, yeah. But, I think 20 years from now, he'll be one of the people speaking at conference. He'll be one of those people, because I can just see a passion. I can see God's power or blessing, something like that. I mean, it's a weird thing to kind of talk about, but I can see that over him or in him or through him, and I just see that he's got this desire. And it's not a personal desire. It's bigger than that for him. It's about his community. It's about the other young men that he sees that they're like him. And I feel like, wow, sitting from my vantage point on the other side of the country, with a whole different other set of cultural backgrounds and stories, just for that glimpse in to somebody else's story, for him to share with me his story and his vision. It just leaves me speechless.
You could be doing the advertisement for this project, the Visions and Dreams project, because you gave one of the foundation quotes for the project is Jean Knudsen Hoffman, that an enemy is one whose story we have not heard. And part of the Visions and Dreams is for people to just hear each other's stories, hear stories of people they wouldn't otherwise know. Not that that's enmity, but it's certainly lack of relationship. Yeah. And it can lead to enmity.
It definitely can. And if not enmity, there's a way that distance, I think anyway, there's a way that even with the absence of enmity, with the absence of conflict, there's a way in which we can sometimes hold ourselves apart. It's sort of like, that's the problem of those people over there. Those people over there are doing their own thing. And I do very strongly believe that if we are going to be in the Jesus movement, as you said, in this church, and in the biggest sense that church can be held as body of Christ together, we can't afford to act like that. It's that old saying, the old biblical saying, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And in fact, that's not a healthy way for the body of all of us, the community of all of us, to be in existence together.
What you were also describing, witnessing in that young man and his community of youth that he's bringing with him, that goes back to what we were talking about with the Brethren DNA. You can see that in him. You can see the relational side of it, and you can see that tempered by the pietist spiritual side. So that it isn't a strict group behavior kind of thing. It's brought to life by this pietist spiritual core.
I don't know that he would ever use any of that language.
Yeah.
And I think he would probably, if pushed to interpret it, would probably say, this comes from my cultural stuff.
That's right.
Isn't that funny? How we sometimes, there's that overlap.
But I would believe that it does come from his culture.
Oh,
I would just say that he's still reflecting that same DNA. Just to say that the brethren bear that DNA doesn't mean that it's the only. I mean, all of our DNA is like 99.999% the same, and most of it isn't even used. So,
right.
Yeah.
No, and I just think that's really interesting that,
But he flourishes. But he flourishes here.
But he flourishes here. He has the potential to flourish
right.
here. Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I hope he does.
Me too. And I look forward to meeting him and his crew at National Youth Conference.
I'll put you in touch. I'll put you in touch. They're really an exciting group. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been great.
Yeah.